Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we are wrestling with a figure who is, well, perhaps the most misunderstood and intensely influential philosopher of the modern era, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yeah, his name just conjures up so much, doesn't it? Radical criticism, controversial ideas.
Exactly. But his philosophy, it's so deeply rooted in his own, frankly, traumatic life. A life marked by extreme personal suffering and these just stunning intellectual reversals.
That's absolutely right. You really can't separate the man from the ideas when you tackle Nietzsche. Our sources today, they give us this comprehensive biographical timeline, but also track the development of these huge concepts like the Übermensch and the will to power.
So our mission today is really to track those personal tragedies, those radical intellectual shifts, to try and understand the crucible, really, that forged his polarizing work.
Yeah, we're looking for those internal contradictions, the surprising moments of clarity, the aha moments, you could say, that explain how he got from point A to point B, because the shifts are just so extreme sometimes.
He's simply unavoidable, isn't he? I mean, he's foundational for existentialism, a touchstone for modern psychology, a catalyst for critical theory.
He's everywhere in modern scholarship.
Yet his legacy is permanently shattered. Not just by his, tragic mental collapse, but by the unforgivable exploitation of his work. First by his own family, and then, of course, later by fascists.
It's a necessary deep dive, absolutely, but it is a heartbreaking one in many ways.
So let's unpack this journey and maybe start somewhere surprising, far from the chaos, in the quiet, almost pious origin, this future radical.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The man who would declare God is dead started life as this, pious, deeply conservative child.
Born October 15th, 1844 in Rücken, Prussia. He was even named Friedrich Wilhelm after the king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, because they shared a birth.
And his early life was completely dominated by his father, Ludwig Nietzsche, who was a respected Lutheran priest. It sounds almost idyllic, highly ordered. He even romanticized it later in his own writings.
A very scholarly, conservative family environment. But this secure little world was just shattered, wasn't it? First by historical events and then by raw personal tragedy.
Yeah, the first shock was external. The revolutions of 1848 sweeping across Europe, which horrified the conservative Nietzsche family.
But the internal shock, that was devastating. His father started suffering from these severe, unexplained seizures, and then he died in July.
It's awful. And it didn't even end there. Only 6 months later, January 1850, his younger brother, Ludwig Joseph, also died.
Can you just imagine the trauma for a 5-year-old boy losing the religious patriarch, the father figure, and then immediately after, the younger brother named Ludwig?
It must have planted the seeds right there for a lifelong struggle with the problem of suffering, with fate, with divine justice, or the lack of it.
After all this, the remaining family, his mother, his sister, they moved to Naumburg to live with his paternal grandmother in a house full of women.
Right. And the young Friedrich, nicknamed Fritz, he was scholarly, but apparently struggled a bit with the move, the urban setting. But his intellectual talents started showing early, particularly through music.
Yes, he was a talented amateur composer, played the piano, wrote short plays, even an early autobiographical.
And this is where we see that first kind of ironic glimpse of his critical spirit, though it's wrapped up in the very moralism he'd later just tear down.
It is a profound irony, isn't it? Our sources point out that at just 13, he's already making these quite severe critical judgments about music.
He defends the classical tradition, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, saying they lead our thoughts to higher things. Basically, music as moral.
But then he denounces contemporary romantics like Liszt and Berlioz, calling them decadent, saying their music exists only for enjoyment or, quote, to make a public exhibition of itself.
So as a teenager, applying this moralistic anti-pleasure judgment that he would spend his entire philosophical career trying to dismantle, it just shows how deeply he absorbed that pietistic upbringing.
Fascinating. From Naumburg, he gets a scholarship to the really prestigious Forda boarding. Focuses on classical languages, Latin, Greek, Hebrew.
And the environment there was intense. Sources say up to 10 hours of study a day. But this rigor, it didn't suppress his burgeoning radicalism. If anything, it refined it.
That classical philology background, it seems crucial. Forda really pushed him to think deeply about history, about text, about structure itself.
And his essays from this period, they show his rebellion starting to crystallize.
The essay Fate and History seems key here. It marks the beginning of his whole quest for philosophical freedom, doesn't it?
Yeah, he realizes that an individual, even if theoretically free, is profoundly constrained by fate, which for him meant ingrained customs, traditions, and especially that Christian morality he'd absorbed since childhood.
So this is the intellectual seed of his later idea of self-overcome. True freedom means constantly battling those inherited constraints. He's already questioning the moral framework of his entire world.
And he wasn't afraid of controversy even then. He defended the poet Friedrich Hölderlin, even supported Napoleon III, apparently shocking his conservative friends.
The music world also provided some early fuel. He initially resisted a friend's enthusiasm for Wagner's Tristan und Isolde, that huge, emotionally overwhelming opera.
But by autumn 1862, he was completely won over. Embraced Wagner wholeheartedly, even took the score back to Forta with him. It's like this intense musical conversion foreshadowed his later philosophical passions.
Which takes us to the final break with his family's intended path for him. Despite his literary interests causing some academic issues, he passed his exams and went to Bonn in 1884 to study theology.
But you can tell he was already struggling. The sources mention his growing religious pessimism.
His real intellectual passion was philology, that cutting-edge 19th century field combining literary criticism, textual analysis, historical framework, a really rigorous technique.
And during the Easter holidays of 1865, he drops the bombshell on his mother. He's not going to become a priest.
And he justifies it using his philological training, which is telling. He cites David Strauss's Life of Jesus, that controversial 1835 book.
Right, arguing that early Christians had basically mythologized the historical Jesus into a divine figure. The realization that Christian theology rested on textual interpretation, on myth-making, rather than some unshakable divine truth that was the final nail in the coffin for his faith.
So he formally transferred to the Faculty of Philology, prioritizing rigorous analysis over inherited faith, a huge step.
This next phase, it's just this whirlwind of meteoric academic rise, intense friendships, idol worship, and tragically the start of the debilitating illness that would really define the rest of his life.
He followed his mentor, the philologist Friedrich Nietzsche, to the University of Leipzig.
And it's in Leipzig he finds his first great philosophical anchor, Arthur Schopenhauer. He apparently stumbled upon Schopenhauer's major work, The World as Will and Representation, in a secondhand book.
And described it as finding a mirror for his own kind of intellectual despair.
Exactly. Schopenhauer offered this complete metaphysical system that was hugely influential in the post-Kantian world. He argued that the world we experience, the empirical world, is just representation. It's constructed by our senses.
Okay, so what we see and touch isn't the real world.
Not the ultimate reality, no. The true world, the thing in itself behind the appearances, Schopenhauer called the will. And this will isn't rational or good. It's this unknowable, relentless, dark energy.
Almost like a pre-Darwinian idea, this pessimistic, struggling, universal life force, a constant, painful striving for survival.
Precisely. It's a blind, irrational striving inherent in everything. And Schopenhauer's solution to the suffering caused by this constant desire was pretty radical for the time.
Which was?
Escape, or at least temporary relief, could only be found through the appreciation of nature and especially art. Music in particular allowed one to momentarily forget the self, to escape the relentless demands of the will.
You can see how that would deeply appeal to Nietzsche, right? Given his love of music and the trauma he'd already experienced.
Absolutely. Meanwhile, his academic career just takes off. He founds a philological club in Leipzig. His work impresses Ritschl so much that he helps get it published in prestigious journals.
But then there's a brief interruption from military service in 1867.
Yeah, caught up in the patriotic fervor around the Prussia versus Austria conflict. He enlisted in an artillery. But in March 1868, he had a bad fall from a horse, injured his chest quite severely.
Ironically, that recovery time gave him more time to write.
It did. He focused on prize-winning essays, which further boosted his academic reputation. His star was definitely...
And then comes this confluence of his idol. Back in Leipzig, October 1868, he's introduced to the composer Richard Wagner.
And Nietzsche was apparently ecstatic to discover that his musical hero was also a huge admirer of Schopenhauer. It cemented the connection.
Then the really unprecedented academic happens.
Astonishing, really. At just 24 years old, based purely on the strength of his published essays and Ritschl's recommendation, he's offered a full professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland.
Without even having finished his doctorate or his teaching qualification. And a good salary, too, 3,000 Swiss francs. It shows how highly they rated.
Definitely. And being in Switzerland brought him physically closer to Wagner, who lived at Trimpschen on Lake Lucerne. Nietzsche became deeply involved in Wagner's intimate circle, visiting frequently.
He formed a particularly strong bond with Wagner's mistress, Cosima von Bülow, who was Franz Liszt's daughter and would later become Wagner's wife. He apparently saw her as epitome of noble.
This intense immersion in Wagner's world, this artistic hothouse, it clearly pulled him further away from dry, technical philology towards grander philosophical questions.
And this shift really culminates in his first major book, The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1870.
He wrote much of it while recovering from illness contracted during the Franco-Prussian. He served briefly as a medical orderly and caught diphtheria and dysentery. So again, physical suffering seems intertwined with his intellectual output, especially a book exploring Greek suffering and tragedy.
And the book itself was revolutionary, wasn't it? It completely threw traditional philology out the window.
Totally. He argued that Greek culture actually peaked before the famous classical era. in the 6th and early 5th centuries BC. And controversially, he claimed that Socrates, the icon of Western reason in the late 5th century, actually represented a kind of degeneration.
Because of Socrates' insistence on rationalism and logic over what?
Pretty much. This leads to his famous dichotomy, the Apollonian versus the Dionysian.
Right. Apollo representing order, reason, clarity, visual arts, individual.
And Dionysus representing chaos, intoxication, music, ecstasy, the loss of self, the primal unity of existence, both creative and destructive.
And he argued that Greek tragedy, their greatest art form, arose from the tension, the struggle between two fundamental forces.
Yeah, and he saw music as the highest expression of the dying spirit. So he dedicated the book to Wagner, believing that Wagner's operas were achieving a modern synthesis, a rebirth of this tragic spirit, balancing Apollo and Dionysus.
But the academic world was not impressed.
Horrified is probably more accurate. His own mentor, Ritschl, publicly disavowed the book. They saw it as wild speculation, philosophical rambling masquerading as philology. It lacked the expected textual rigor.
And this academic backlash had real consequences for him professionally.
Oh, definitely. Our sources mention his course enrollment just plummeted. Apparently, he once returned to Basel after a break to find only 2 students had signed up for one of his courses, a huge blow to his academic standing.
The lesson seemed to be, philology is fine for analyzing the past, but don't you dare use it to fundamentally challenge the pillars of Western thought, like Socratic.
He seemed undeterred, though. He just turned his critical gaze outwards towards contemporary German culture. In his next works, The Untimely Meditation.
Here he attacked the German education, didn't he? Seeing it becoming too functional, too democratic in a bad way.
Yes, he felt it was just training people for jobs, not cultivating genuine scholarship or striving for cultural greatness. It was becoming mediocre, in his view.
And he got into a really fiery polemic against Strauss, the very guy whose book had helped him leave theology years earlier.
Right. Strauss had published a book called The Old and New Faith, which dismissed Schopenhauer's pessimism as the product of a putrefying brain. Nietzsche just went after him.
Saw Strauss as representing everything wrong with German culture, complacent, seeking ease.
Exactly. Cultural Philistinism, he called. He followed this with a really important essay on the use and abuse of history for life. He argued history should inspire us, remind us of human potential for greatness, but warned against blind hero worship or getting bogged down in mere fact.
But all this time, his health was becoming a major issue. Gastric problems, severe headache, failing eyesight, fainting spells.
Yeah, the physical suffering was becoming immense. Scholars still debate the cause. Tertiary syphilis is often suggested, maybe a brain tumor, but the reality for him was constant debilitating.
And this physical collapse seems to coincide with a major intellectual shift, doesn't it? Especially regarding Wagner and Schopenhauer.
It does. He was influenced by his friend, the positivist thinker, Dr. Paul Rée. While grappling with his failing health, he finished the last of the Meditation, the one on Richard Wagner in Beirut in 1976. It already shows a complex ambivalence.
He started questioning Schopenhauer's pessimism and grew critical of Wagner's direction.
Yes, Wagner's increasing German nationalism, the spectacle of the Beirut Festival, started to bother him. And maybe Schopenhauer's denial of the will just seemed impossible when his own life required such a fierce effort just to endure the physical pain.
There's a note here that a doctor in 1877 diagnosed a damaged optic nerve and told him to completely stop reading and writing years.
Which, of course, knowing Nietzsche, was advice he completely ignored.
This whole period culminates in his 1878 book, Human, All Too, a collection of aphorisms dedicated to free spirit. This marks a huge break.
A massive declaration of intellectual independence, a complete reversal of his earlier Schopenhauerian and Wagnerian allegiances.
What were the key reversals?
Well, first, he declares there are no eternal truths. Kant, Schopenhauer misguided by metaphysics. Second, he places science on a higher level than art. Art, he now says, is just a temporary bridge, leading the mind away from superstition towards free-thinking analysis.
Wow, that's a direct hit on his birth of tragedy ideas.
Absolutely. And crucially, he argues that Christian notions of good and evil are purely social construct, no rational basis, just human creations often rooted in psychological needs or power dynamics.
How did Wagner...
Wagner was reportedly so furious, especially at the elevation of science over art and the rejection of morality, that he refused to even read the book, sent it back.
Many of his friends were appalled too, particularly by the attack on morality. But Nietzsche just doubled down.
He did. He wrote a second part arguing that Christian humility wasn't virtuous at all, but actually a kind of self-centered calculation to avoid damnation. By May 1879, his health was so bad he had to resign his professorship at Basel.
But they gave him a decent pension, 3,000 Swiss francs a year.
Yes, which ironically gave him the freedom from teaching duties, freedom from academic constraints that led to his most intensely productive philosophical period.
And he used that independence right away in The Wanderer and His Shadow later that year.
denouncing abstract concepts like the salvation of the soul. And he directly took on Rousseau's idea of the social contract, arguing communities didn't arise from voluntary agreement, but from necessity, external threats. Early justice, he claimed, was basically just legalized revenge.
Many of these ideas, as you said, prefigure later developments in anthropology and sociology. He was really breaking new ground, even as his health crumbled. So, the early 1880s, Nietzsche is now independent but perpetually restless, a philosophical wanderer constantly moving light, Venice, the Swiss Alps, seeking climates that might ease his relentless health problems.
Right. He wrote Morning Glow during this time, published in 1881. It deepens his critique of Christian morality, but also shows this interesting, somewhat unusual appreciation for Eastern thought, particularly Buddhism.
Why Buddhism?
He seemed to appreciate its psychological realism, you could say. It acknowledged suffering without resorting to divine explanations or promises of heavenly reward. It cast aside gods in favor of individual effort towards enlightenment. He saw it as more intellectually honest, in a way, than Christianity.
But despite the intellectual output, he was deeply lonely, wasn't he? There's a note from January 1882 during a rare spell of good health where he apparently joked about needing a wife.
That loneliness, that longing for connection, it leads directly into the famous and ultimately disastrous episode with Lou Salome.
Ah, yes, the Lou Salome. Tell us about that.
In April 1882, in Rome, through his friend Paul Ray, he meets this brilliant, captivating 21-year-old Russian writer and intellectual, Lou von Salome.
And Nietzsche was instantly impressed, saw her as a potential intellectual heir almost.
Completely captivated by her intellect, yes. The three of them, Salome, Ray, and Nietzsche, even had this plan, briefly, for a kind of philosophical commune, a trinity, they called it, maybe in Vienna or Paris.
Nietzsche publicly maintained his interest was purely intellectual, didn't he? Trying to keep it on a high philosophical plane.
He did, yes. But his sister Elizabeth and his mother were deeply suspicious about the propriety of it all. In his private notebooks, well, they reveal a different story. He admitted his feelings for Salome had become more than just intellectual, had taken on a physical dimension.
So this philosophical trinity quickly became a very tense emotional triangle.
Extremely tense. Ray became intensely jealous of Nietzsche spending time alone with Salome. And Salome herself, a fiercely independent thinker, bristled at Nietzsche's attempts to essentially mold her intellectually, to control her thinking. She refused to be just his disciple.
And the whole thing just collapsed.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
It was a huge personal humiliation for Nietzsche, the philosopher who preached self-mastery. He was plunged into a deep depression. Sources say he relied heavily on chloral hydrate, an opium derivative, to cope with both the emotional fallout and his physical pain.
Yet somehow this intense emotional turmoil seems to have fueled his most famous philosophical creation.
It absolutely did. In the same year, 1882, he published Joyous Science, sometimes translated as The Gay Science. It's a pivotal work.
He engages with Darwinism here, right?
Yeah.
Accepts biological evolution, but challenges the simple survival of the fittest idea.
Yes, and his critique is fascinating. He uses cultural examples. He points out that many individuals who greatly enriched human culture, think Raphael, Mozart, perhaps even himself, died young, often without heirs. Their contribution wasn't about crude reproductive success.
So fitness in a purely biological sense isn't the only measure of value.
Exactly. He calls for an intellectual war on behalf of science against religion, but he also introduces this complex idea that human existence is simultaneously comic and tragic.
Comic how? Tragic how?
Comic because of the sheer vanity of us short-lived humans thinking we can master nature. Tragic because we're infinitesimally small in this vast, indifferent cosmos. There's a profound sense of cosmic irony.
And this intellectual war, this grappling with meaning after the Salome disaster, it leads directly into Thus Spake Zarathustra,
his defining epic work, written in stages between 1883 and 1885. This is where he finally establishes his own unique philosophical voice, completely independent of Schopenhauer or Wagner.
And he uses the figure of Zarathustra, the ancient Persian prophet Zoroaster, as his mouth, which is interesting because he rejected Zoroastrianism's core idea of a cosmic battle between good and
right. He borrows a figure but completely repurposes him. And this book gives us arguably his most famous and most misunderstood declaration, God is dead.
It's crucial to get this right, isn't it? This wasn't Nietzsche celebrating, it was a diagnosis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He was observing that science, modernity, secularism, they had eroded the foundations of Christian belief. The Christian God was no longer a credible source of ultimate value or meaning for the modern world.
And the consequence of that death.
Profound nihilism. If God is dead, then all the objective morality, truth, and purpose that were based on God they collapse too. Humanity is left in this terrifying vacuum. The book itself, framed almost like a parody of the Gospels, a fifth gospel, signals humanity's moving towards a new, perhaps higher evolutionary state, but the transition is perilous.
So the rest of the book is about how to respond to this nihil, how to create meaning in a godless world.
Precise, which leads to his first major concept in Zarathustra, the Überman, often translated as Overman or Superman, but that's easily misunderstood.
What's the core idea? What is the Übermensch meant?
The Übermensch is the meaning creator. In the absence of God, humanity must overcome itself, transcend its current limitations. The Übermensch represents a future type of human characterized by rationality, creativity, self-mastery, and a connection to higher culture. Someone who can affirm life despite the suffering and meaninglessness and create their own value. It's not a fixed state, but a goal, process of constant self-overcoming.
Okay, so it's about creating value. How does that connect to his second big idea, introduced in part 2 of Zarathustra, the will to power? You said earlier he rejected Schopenhauer's struggle for survival.
Yes, Schopenhauer's will was this blind, negative, pessimistic striving. Nietzsche transforms. The will to power isn't just about surviving. It's an intrinsic, fundamental drive in all things, organic and inorganic, towards growth, expansion, mastery, overcoming resistance, discharging strength.
So it's not necessarily about dominating others.
Not primarily, though. That can be one manifestation. It's more fundamental. It's the drive behind creativity, behind art, behind philosophy, behind the formation of society. Every relationship, every interpretation of the world, according to Nietzsche, is driven by this desire to impose form, to control, to express power.
And he applied this historically to things like Christianity.
Exactly. He argued Christianity triumphed, not because it was divinely true, but because its system of morality and control proved useful to the Roman emperors, serving their will to power, their material purpose. The church, he argued, quickly became about worldly power, estranged from Christ's original message. A new morality, he believed, must acknowledge and affirm this fundamental will to power.
And the final key concept from Zarathustra, introduced in part 3, is maybe the most challenging: eternal.
Yeah, this one is tough. It's the idea that because time is infinite, but the amount of matter and energy in the universe is finite, then every possible configuration of things must eventually repeat itself.
Meaning everything that has happened, every single moment, every joy, every pain, every mistake will happen again, exactly the same way, infinitely.
That's the horrifying thought experiment, yes. It's presented as the ultimate test, Zarathustra asked. If a demon were to tell you that you must live this exact same life, down to the smallest detail, again and again forever, would you collapse in despair and curse the demon? Or would you embrace? Would you say, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"?
To affirm eternal recurrence, to be able to say yes to living your life exactly as it is an infinite number of times, that becomes the ultimate affirmation of life.
So the Übermensch is the one who can affirm eternal recurrence, who can love their fate, morphati, to such an extent that they would will it to repeat forever.
That's the implication. It imbues every single moment of life with infinite weight. If this moment will return eternally, how should you live it? It's a radical call to live authentically and intense in the present.
After the intense, poetic, almost prophetic style of Zarathustra, Nietzsche seems to have struggled a bit, didn't he? Finding a publisher was difficult.
Yeah, his books weren't selling. Hundreds of copies of earlier works were just sitting in storage. He actually had to publish his next major work, Beyond Good and Evil, 6, at his own expense.
But this lack of public recognition didn't exactly mellow his views. This book sounds like a return to a more direct, polemical style, a brutal statement of his mature philosophy. Absolutely. He moves away from Zarathustra's mythical frame and gets straight to the point, and launches this really forceful attack on the core values of modernity, especially democratization and egalitarianism.
He genuinely believed that human progress, particularly cultural creativity, happened mainly in aristocratic society.
He did. He argued they fostered what he called master morality. He saw democracy and the push for equality as dangerous trends, stemming from what he termed slave morality, which he traced back to Christian origin. He thought it prioritized comfort, security, and mediocrity over the struggle for greatness and excellence.
Okay, wait, that sounds deeply problematic, doesn't it, to our modern ears? Is he really saying sympathy, caring for the weak, these are somehow moral?
He wouldn't see them as failings, perhaps, but as strategy. He argued that morality isn't divinely given or universally true. It's an artificial construct created by humans, often to serve specific group interests and power dynamics. And he famously broke this down into two fundamental types, tracing their origins through language and history.
This is the famous master versus slave morality distinction.
Exactly. Master morality, he argued, originates with the powerful, the noble, the ruling class. Its values like courage, pride, strength, creativity, arise from a position of power and self-affirmation. Good initially just meant noble or powerful.
And slave morality.
Slave morality, conversely, originates with the oppressed, the weak, the priestly classes. He often associated it with the origins of Judaism and Christianity in the Levant. It arises out of resentment towards the powerful. Its values like sympathy, humility, patience, kindness are essentially a way of coping with powerlessness and subtly undermining the values of the masters. Good becomes associated with harmless or pitiable.
He really dug into this historical analysis next book on the genealogy of morality. Many see this as one of his most rigorous and significant.
It's a sustained attempt to trace the historical and psychological development of Judeo-Christian morality over millennia, using his philological tools to dissect concepts like guilt, bad conscience, and ascetic ideal.
He makes some pretty bold historical claims here too, doesn't he?
Oh yeah. He argues, for instance, that the Germanic warrior tribes who conquered the Roman Empire effectively saved Europe from becoming a complete Christian theocracy because they imposed an aristocratic hierarchy based on master value. Conversely, he saw things like the Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution as resurgences of slave morality, elevating the values of the herd.
It's quite something how he turns the tools of historical and linguistic analysis, the very tools that dismantled his religious faith, onto the foundations of Western morality.
He's using the historian's and philologist's scalpel to dissect the value systems that produced him. It's relentless. Then comes 1888, an incredible year, almost unbelievable creative output.
Despite his constant health issues, he apparently experienced his best health in years while staying in Turin, Italy.
And it led to this explosion of writing. He conceived this massive 4-volume project, The Will to Power, meant to be the grand synthesis of his entire philosophy.
But he abandoned that.
He did. Never finished it in the form he envisioned. Instead, he channeled that energy into a series of shorter, sharper, polemical works, written at incredible speed.
Like the case of Wagner, a final, brutal settling of accounts with his former idol.
Absolutely vicious, some would say. He casts Wagner as the ultimate symbol of modern cultural decadence, artistic insincerity, and decay, savaging his later turn towards Christian themes and German nationalism.
Then Twilight of the Idol, a more lighthearted title, parodying Wagner's opera Twilight of the Gods.
Lighter in tone, maybe, but still full of sharp attacks on philosophical and cultural idols he opposed. Sort of a rapid-fire summary of his core critiques.
And then perhaps the most provocative title of all, The Antichrist.
Yeah, this one delves into the origins of Christianity. And here, the nuance is really important. He's surprisingly, well, not exactly favorable towards the historical Jesus, but distinguishes him sharply from Christianity. He argues that Jesus' actual teachings were about achieving a certain state of being in this life, living free from resentment, hatred, judgment. He even compares this aspect favorably to Buddhism, which he saw as psychologically realistic. He has that famous line, Buddhism makes no promises but keeps them. Christianity promises everything but keeps nothing.
So his attack wasn't really on Jesus himself, but on what came after, on the church.
Precisely. He blames the early Christians, the apostles like Paul, for fundamentally distorting Jesus' message. They imposed doctrines of sin, judgment, heaven, hell systems of reward and punishment designed, in Nietzsche's view, to control people through fear and guilt, turning Jesus' internal message into an external system of power.
Wow. And then, to mark his 44th birthday in October 1888, he quickly wrote an autobiography, Ecce Homo, Behold the Man.
Written in just 3 weeks. It's an attempt to explain himself to clear up misunderstanding, but it's done in this highly provocative, almost megalomaniacal style.
The chapter titles alone are something else. Why am I so wise? Why I write such good book?
Exactly. It's filled with self-praise, deliberately shocking claims. He declares Zarathustra superior to anything by Goethe, Shakespeare, or Dante, and he uses it to firmly state his case about Wagner, arguing it was Wagner who changed, who degenerated by pandering to German nationalism, not him.
It feels like he's desperately trying to control the narrative, maybe sensing the end was near.
That incredible burst of creativity in 1888, it just stopped suddenly. Catastrophically. At the very end of the year, his mental state completely collapsed, irreversibly.
He started writing these deeply delusional letters, didn't he? To royalty, to political...
Yes, letters addressed to Kaiser Wilhelm II, to Bismarck, even to the Pope, filled with grandiose claims, denunciations, orders for political figures to be shot, completely divorced from reality.
And the public collapse came in January 1889 in Turin. The famous story with the horse.
Heartbreaking. He apparently saw a horse being flogged mercilessly by its driver in the Piazza Carlo Albergo, ran over, threw his arms around the horse's neck to protect it, and then just collapsed, weeping. That was effectively the end of his conscious life.
He was brought back to Germany, initially to an asylum, then eventually into the care of his mother in Naumburg.
Medical diagnoses followed, but it's still debated. Tertiary syphilis, contracted perhaps decades earlier, is the most common explanation. But others suggest a brain tumor, or maybe a rare form of dementia, given the suddenness and severity of the decline. Whatever the specific cause, the philosophical mind was gone. He lived for another 11 years, but essentially vacant.
Just tragic. But the tragedy doesn't end there, does it? Because just as Nietzsche argued Christ's teachings were distorted by followers, his own ideas were about to be twisted, largely thanks to his sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche.
Elizabeth, yeah. She plays a crucial and deeply damaging role in his legacy. She was a staunch German nationalist, married to Bernhard Förster, an infamous anti-Semite.
They tried to found an Aryan colony in Paraguay, which failed miserably, and Förster ended up taking...
That's right. When Elizabeth returned to Germany after that debacle, she moved swiftly to take control of her now incapacitated brother and his unpublished writings, including things like The Antichrist and his notebook.
And she sidelined people who actually knew his philosophy, like his loyal friend and editor, Peter Gath, Heinrich Koselleck.
Completely marginalized. She also renewed her vicious attacks on Luz Salome, conveniently blaming her for Friedrich's breakdown. By 1895, she'd bought out her own mother's rights to his royalties, securing total legal and financial control over his literary estate.
And she set up this Nietzsche archive in Weimar, treating her brother almost like a living exhibit.
Yes, after their mother died in 1897, she moved him to the Villa Silberblick in Weimar. She curated his image, received admirers, and began heavily editing and selectively publishing his notes, promoting a version of his philosophy that aligned with her own nationalist and anti-Semitic views.
Views that Nietzsche himself had often explicitly rejected, especially in his later work.
Absolutely. Nietzsche died on August 25, 1900, age 55, from pneumonia following a stroke. And the final irony.
He was buried in the family plot next to his father, the Lutheran priest, in the churchyard in Ruck. The iconoclast buried in consecrated ground by the vicar's
A deeply ironic end. But the distortion of his legacy was really just beginning. Elizabeth actively promoted her brother as a forerunner of German nationalism and, yes, anti-Semitism.
And she courted the rising Nazi party.
She became a fervent admirer. She received Adolf Hitler at the Nietzsche archive on several occasions in the 1930s. It was largely through her manipulation, particularly her posthumous compilation and editing of his notes under the title The Will to Power, that concepts like Superman, will to power, and master morality were twisted and appropriated by the Nazis.
Stripped of all nuance, used to justify their horrific ideology.
Exactly. It's the ultimate perversion of his thought. Our source material is very clear on. While his provocative language could be easily cherry-picked, attributing fascist or genuinely anti-Semitic views to Nietzsche himself, especially his mature philosophy, is simply inaccurate. He spent his last productive years railing against German nationalism and the kind of cultural mediocrity his sister later championed in his name. #outro.
So if we try to separate his ideas from that horrific misappropriation, his influence remains just immense, doesn't it? Across so many...
Absolutely. Philosophy, history, psychology, anthropology, literary criticism, political theory. His impact is undeniable. He really laid the groundwork for so much of 20th century existential thought, with his diagnosis of the death of God and the resulting crisis of meaning in secular modernity.
The sheer range of his work is staggering, from detailed philological analysis to sweeping cultural critique to tense psychological introspection. His originality blinding, really.
But, and it's a big but, his core message, his rejection of egalitarianism, his critique of conventional morality, his seeming embrace of hierarchy and suffering as necessary for greatness, it remains deeply challenging, even unpalatable for many of us today.
Which brings us back to the man himself. We've seen how his life, the constant illness, the personal tragedies like his father's death or the Salome affair, his relentless physical pain, his equally relentless pursuit of intellectual independence.
Yeah.
How all of this fueled his thought, often leading to those dramatic reversals and radical conclusions.
He forces you to ask that difficult question.
Right. So the final question for you, the listener, after diving into this complex, brilliant, tormented life, was Friedrich Nietzsche fundamentally a profound, maybe even prophetic thinker, urging humanity towards a higher cultural and intellectual plane, demanding we affirm life even in the face?
Or were his most challenging, disruptive, and perhaps dangerous ideas ultimately the product of a mind extreme isolation, perhaps in those final frantic years, already rest something to think about?